MGX Minerals is revolutionizing the new energy economy with patented lithium extraction technology, replacing traditional solar evaporation using low-cost, low-energy nanofiltration. The first system of this paradigm shift technology is currently being commissioned. MGX Minerals trades on the CSE, symbol XMG, the OTCQB, symbol MGXMF, and Frankfurt, symbol 1MG. For more information, visit our website, mgxminerals.com.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Bev Harris. She's the founder of Black Box Voting, online at blackboxvoting.org. She's speaking to us from Carlsbad, Washington. Bev, welcome to the Goddard Report. And I was just asking you before we went on air, where is Carlsbad, Washington exactly?
Well, we're out on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. It's a beautiful location, kind of out near the Olympic National Park.
So people in BC for sure can identify with being near the ocean and big trees.
Yep, exactly. We're in God's country.
Can you tell us about your book, Black Box Voting, and what got you interested in it?
Well, I had been writing for, a couple of decades, and in the 90s I wrote about financial crime, and, got into the nitty-gritty of how people embezzle and how they move things from one place to another, and also how they hide things in complexity, okay? And when I started looking at how the election system was changing once we computerized it, I realized that they did not have the auditing checks and balances that are needed. And elections are very much like money. In fact, they control a lot of money. So you have to treat them not on a basis of trust or who's a nice guy, but on the basis of verification and being able to see every single transaction.
And was there one single incident that got you interested in the topic, or was it just a general interest?
Well, I knew that if you start running elections in a way that people cannot verify, and that isn't just paper ballots. Paper ballots are necessary, but you also have to be able to look at the paper ballots after the election to see, to count them up and check if they're really right. You can't just depend on the government to tell you. If you just wait for the government to tell you, trust us, we're going to do this right, you're just letting the government choose itself, essentially. So you have to have a way for the public to be able to authenticate the results. And you could do that with hand-counted paper ballots at the polling places because it was right there in front of you. Once we switched over to computers, then that became something that's much more difficult to see. Now, there are ways to verify it, but they weren't using those ways, and even though those ways are still very readily available, there's a tremendous resistance now among election officials to let anybody from the public actually authenticate the results, which frankly is a bit suspicious. If you look at it like money, and if you go into your bank and you say, I want to confirm the amount of money that you're telling me is in my account is really there, can you show me the records? And they say, oh, no, you can't see anything. You're going to get pretty suspicious. And so elections, it kind of got me interested when I realized I had written about embezzlement a good bit in the 90s. I had met a lot of embezzlers, which are some of the nicest people. They seem perfectly normal. They don't look, they don't give you any outward signs that they have this defect where they're stealing your money. And once I started looking at how the voting system worked, I knew it was like there's going to be theft. So I started looking at, I started asking and trying to rule out, how can we check? Well, if we can't check, who checks? Well, if these people check, who checks them, And as I started asking those questions, every single answer was basically the wrong answer. And I knew that people were doing things they shouldn't.
What are the most common forms of voter fraud?
Well, first of all, we don't call it voter fraud because that implies it's a bunch of people, individuals, who get it in their mind that they're going to run around and do something. It's election fraud. Election fraud, it can be executed by just one person. If they get some inside access or if they can pay somebody to do it. So election fraud is the way you want to look at it. 65% of all bank thefts are not by a bank robber. They're by an insider. They're by someone who, can stick their hand in the till and take it because they're there. So the most common forms, there's basically three ways that you can attack an election. And any and all are and have been used here or there. The three ways are you can attack who is able to vote, in other words, the voter list itself. You can attack who can vote, in other words, of the people who, that sounds like the same thing. Who can vote, who did vote, I guess you can say. Who can vote, who did vote, and the counting of the vote. Who can vote is the voter list. Who did vote is the participating voter list. So, in other words, if you suppress or you stuff ballots, then you're attacking who did vote. Or you can attack the counting of the vote. And any of those three ways, or a combination of them, will do. And as far as the most common ways, it's really hard to say because the counting of the vote is so opaque that it's not really very authenticatable. So we don't really know how often that's done. We know it's done sometimes. We do have documentation that every one of the three methods have been used at one time or another in one place or another.
Is the ballot box the most likely place for election fraud to take place?
Well, it depends on the laws and the procedures, which vary a great deal by jurisdiction. For example, in the United States, we now have the state of Washington, where I live, is 100% vote by mail. So is Oregon, and about 80% of California and Arizona are vote by mail. Colorado is. 25 states are now largely vote by mail. And so if the vote by mail is just sitting there ready to be exploited, I would say in the states, in the locations that have unrestricted vote by mail, that would be the number one area to look at. Because you can impact by stuffing ballots into the pool, you can impact by ditching ballots. Whole bags of ballots are fairly regularly found, hiding behind copiers or in a closet somewhere 2 years later. And you can also affect it by they're counted by voting machine, and you can affect it by affecting the count. So, vote by mail is hugely high risk. Some of the other areas that I think are also high risk, obviously any place that doesn't have paper ballots, and any place that doesn't allow paper ballots, that has paper ballots, but says they're not a public record. A public record would be, you can go in and you can ask under Freedom of Information or public records laws in almost any country in the world now, to be able to examine documents, because after all, we pay for the government. We actually kind of own the documents. So you can go and you can ask to see any number of kinds of public documents. Ballots are a public document. The list of who voted is a public document. But there are a number of places that either throw them away, destroy them, even though the law says they have to keep them, or prohibit the public from ever seeing them.
Should you suspect a vote count if it's a place that allows ballots to be destroyed?
You should definitely be suspicious about election fraud. Absolutely. In fact, Broward County, Florida, which is Fort Lauderdale, Florida, there was a high-profile election in 2016. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was a very controversial head of the Democratic National Committee, was running against a guy named Tim Canova. And when Tim lost the election, he simply requested to see the ballots. And in Florida, it's very clear anybody can inspect the ballots. The law says you can. But the election supervisor, even though the federal law requires that they retain them for 22 months and allow the public to see them, she destroyed them immediately. Well, the voting machines, the new ones, now take a picture of every ballot. It's called a ballot image. So he asked to see the ballot images, and she said, oh, I destroyed those too. Well, now, in those kinds of cases, the correct remedy is actually to run a new election, because you can't destroy the underlying data and then say that the election is valid.
Well, couldn't that person be charged with something similar to obstruction of justice, where you destroy evidence?
She should certainly be removed from office, and I believe the governor of Florida is now considering that. But quite often there are no consequences. It's called, in legal terms, it's called spoliation of evidence. If you have a court case, no matter what it's about, and you have some evidence that is subpoenaed and you are supposed to come up with it, and you instead throw it in the incinerator and say, I'm sorry, it no longer exists, the judge can instruct the jury that they should make an assumption that you did something untoward with it. Okay? As soon as you engage in spoliation of evidence, it is considered proper to suspect you for wrongdoing. And so that's not, though, the kind of public way of looking at it. And we have to get to that point. Look, if we have an election official who engaged in spoliation of evidence, which are the key records, the ballots, the voter list of who voted, they should be considered under suspicion for tampering with the election. It has to be that way. And so there are really solutions, and I think right now what we're looking at is not how to solve the problem, but to force people the election officials to actually abide by the rules. And in some jurisdictions, they have changed the rules and said, okay, you can destroy them. Hurry up and destroy them. No one can see them. Those jurisdictions, those laws need to be changed. They're very suspicious, and I would call them, fraud protection laws.
Is the problem that the very people who were elected probably were elected because of the fraudulent means, and why would they want to change the rules or enforce them?
Well, there's a lot of motivations, and there's many different levels where elections are at risk. In other words, there's municipal elections, there's provincial and state elections, there's federal elections, and each one of those has kind of a different swirling current of people who want to influence it. But the driving force is particularly at the local and state or provincial level is money. There are billions of dollars worth of contracts that are decided upon by elected officials. And when you control billions of dollars, where it goes and who gets it, there's a lot of people who would want to put their thumb on the scale as to who gets to make that decision.
We'll have more with Bev Harris right after the break.
Hi, I'm Douglas Mason, President and CEO of Rainy Mountain Royalty Corp., RMO, on the TSX Venture Exchange. Rainy Mountain's Brunswick property is located in the Rideout Shear Zone in Ontario, with grab samples running as high as 32 grams per ton gold. A follow-up drill program to test numerous targets located by recent groundwork is planned for early 2018. Please visit our website at rmroyalty.com.
Vatic Ventures Corp. is a potash exploration company focused on the Korat Basin in Thailand, the world's largest undeveloped potash resource. Vatic's management has extensive potash exploration and development experience in Thailand. Vatic will have marketing advantage compared to Western producers. Drill program commences this spring. Vatic trades on the TSX Venture, symbol VCV, and on Frankfurt, symbol V8V2. Visit our website, vaticventures.com.
Welcome back to the Goddard Report. We're speaking with Bev Harris, author of the book Black Box Voting. Bev, how does computerized voting work, and how easily can it be compromised?
Well, they have a number of different systems. And, particularly the systems where you walk up and push a button and there's no paper record and you can never see anything. It is literally child's play to manipulate that, and you will never be caught. And they give you quite a song and dance about how secure it is, but it's not. And I've worked with the systems, and I've worked with the software myself, and at one point we actually trained a chimpanzee to rig the count. It really is not difficult. But we're going to have, most likely, computers in elections in some way, shape, or form. And there is one method now that is really got a lot of promise, and it doesn't cost anything extra. And in most cases, it doesn't require changing any new laws. Isn't that exciting? Basically, if you have a paper ballot, there are pretty much all of the new paper ballot voting machines that process the paper ballot take a picture of it. And these pictures are saved as image files. And they're saved unless you opt in a menu item. You know, it's just like one of the things you click in your computer. You can say, please do not save it, but it saves it. And for example, in Madison, Wisconsin, the county there, they decided, well, let's just put all the ballot images on the web so everyone can look at them. It doesn't even cost anything. Okay, and then anybody can conduct their own recount of everything or anything. They also did that in a Northern California county. Some other places have said, well, we're not going to put them on the web, but we're going to let anybody come in and get them on CD or whatever. Then, of course, you can manipulate an image, a computer image file. So the key there to make sure that it's safe is to have a unique identification number on every ballot. It doesn't tie to the voter. It's just a unique, it could even be stamped on after voting, but it's just a unique ID. So that the ballot image would have a unique ID, and the actual ballot itself would have a matching unique ID. And if you were suspicious that someone had tampered with ballot images, you could simply go and do your own audit by comparing them together, using that I wouldn't call it a serial number, but a unique identification number to yoke them together. This is already being done in a lot of places. The new voting machines all have that capability, and in most places, the public ability to look at this stuff falls under Freedom of Information laws. So why isn't it being done? Well, that's where we get things become much more suspicious. That's where we started asking for the ballot images. I think I asked for the first ones back in 2006 from the state of Colorado. There's a fellow named John Brakey who's been basically doing lawsuit after lawsuit in the United States, forcing them to keep the ballot images, forcing them to let him look. That's when we're discovering that they are engaging in destruction of evidence as fast as they can. And not every place. I have ballot images from a lot of places where they say, sure, here they are, and you can look at the ballots. But other locations say, oh, no, we threw those away. We have to throw them away. You can't see them. And those are the locations we need to zero in on.
If hand-counted paper ballots are used, can counts and recounts be jeopardized?
Well, counts with hand-counted paper ballots can and have been altered, but it's much more difficult because it's so transparent. For example, there was an election in Texas, which was actually one of, he later became a president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of his elections for Senate. They manipulated the hand-counted paper ballot election by simply stuffing votes in, when nobody was at the polling place, and then they discovered it because they entered the people's names in the polling book as if they arrived all in alphabetical order. And then suddenly they burned the polling books up, So it's like, well, we have a problem. So it can be done, but it is also much more likely to get caught. So the thing is, like any kind of fraud, you can't really pass a law or make a system so it'll never be done, but at least you want it to be transparent enough that you have to be a stupid criminal to do it.
I was wondering, would facial recognition technology work if you were just putting X's on a ballot? Could it pick up the difference between all the different X's, and would it point out ones that were exactly the same?
You know, you have got that exactly right. In fact, black box voting in 2006, we developed a software that would identify, it would not really facial recognition, but pixel recognition. In other words, if you blow up a picture that's a computer picture, it's basically a bunch of small dots. And it would identify whether you had ballots that had exactly the same pixel pattern. When you've got 90 races on a ballot, or however many, it's not uncommon here in the U.S., 90 choices, people are voting different ways with a pen, you know, it's not going to have, you're not going to have 2,000 ballots that have identical pixelation. So yes, that can be done. That's one of the great things about having the ballot images in addition to being able to hand count if you so choose, because you can actually very quickly determine if you've got duplicated ballots.
We'll have more with Bev Harris right after this.
Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications, patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Bev Harris, the writer of the book Black Box Voting. Bev, is it possible that some of our elected leaders were not actually elected?
Oh, it's certain. I mean, the system is so porous and so easily gamed for election fraud, particularly for someone. In fact, some of the systems are actually kind of designed for it. That there's no doubt that this is exploited in different places. It's difficult to know how many and exactly where, because people always have theories, you know. Well, I just know this person won because everybody told me they were voting for it. You don't. You only know if you have evidence, and you only have evidence if you can audit the thing. And that means you have to be able to audit who can vote, who did vote, and the counting of the vote. It can be done by ordinary citizens, though, in most locations, unless they've passed some of these obstructive, fraud protection laws. For example, there was the presidential election in 2004. There were citizens who really felt that John Kerry won the state of Ohio, which would have made him win the United States. Well, Ohio let them, of course, under freedom of information, they were able to come in and examine all the ballots for themselves. It was just a little team of citizens that went around. Same thing happened in Florida in 2000, where a team of reporters went around examining the ballots. There again, though, that's when things got very interesting. In Ohio, there's an article on the web on this somewhere. I think it's called "The Dog Ate My Homework." It has something like, 88 counties or something like that, and almost half the counties destroyed the ballots against federal law, and they would have the most ridiculous excuses like, someone got into the ballot vault and spilled an urn of coffee on. Now, you have to understand, this is like 150,000 ballots, like big ballots, and they were all destroyed, or they fell in a swimming pool. It was really the dog ate my homework time. But when you observe obstruction, or you observe destruction of things, one of the things we tell people to do is to document it. If a person is telling you that, whip out your cell phone and videotape them telling you that ridiculous thing. And quite often when those kinds of things happen, although they haven't been able to reverse the election, they have very often been able to get the election officials replaced.
The province of Ontario has an election on June 7th. Does Ontario use voting machines that could cause the results to be questioned?
Well, at least in some of the elections they do. Canada tends to use, as it's my understanding, if things haven't changed, they use them in the municipal elections for sure. And I think in the provincial elections, the national elections in Canada, at least up to a while ago, were still hand counted because they had only one race on them. And Canada, in particular, some of the locations in Ontario, have been trying to push through internet voting. They've had numerous meltdowns with it. Internet voting is the worst of all worlds. You can't really see who did vote. You can't tell anything because the person who controls the server controls everything. And you can't see anything, and it doesn't really leave the type of evidence that really can prove anything.
How can the people of Ontario expose any possible election fraud? And if they did, what should they be looking for?
Well, one thing they should do is ask for, even ahead of the election, ask to make sure they retain the ballot images and see what they say. Say, I want to see the ballot images, and make sure, are you going to keep the ballot images? That, in fact, is done often even before an election, because then that's when they'll tell you, oh, no, we plan to destroy everything. Or they'll say, our system can't do it. Most of the systems in use today, unless they're really antiquated, and I'm talking about designed in the 1980s, most of the systems produce these ballot images. And those ballot images should be retained. And the very next step is to say, I'd like to see all your ballot images. And the next step would be, if you get to see those, is hey, I'd like to examine the actual ballots. Let me just pull a couple precincts and have a look at them, using Freedom of Information law. And one of the ways I determine whether there's a likelihood of fraud is how much they resist those simple steps. If they're very resistive and obstructive, there's a much greater chance that they did something they shouldn't.
How are votes counted in the U.S.? Do you have scrutineers who do it, or is it an outside agency? Is it a government agency? Who does it?
We have no such thing as scrutineers, and there are multiple levels where different entities get their hands on the count. For example, locally, you can have, your local IT guy get in there and mess around. But also, you have this company called SOE Software, which produces the results. It's like their deal is, we'll do the website and we'll, combine everything and produce your results report. They control about 1,000 jurisdictions in the United States right now. So that's a very centralized point. And there are these, I call them middlemen, where their job is, a lot of election officials, especially in small areas, they're not really computer people, and they have to wear a lot of hats. They're doing all kinds of other jobs not involved with elections. And so you'll have these guys who they operate a little mom and pop shop out of their basement, and their deal is that they will help do all the technical stuff on your election for you. We found one such guy literally operating out of his house, off the books, very, very sketch. I mean, we couldn't find out very much about him, and he was basically controlling every county in the state of Arizona except for one. And he would just email them the results.
Canada has a...
Yeah.
Canada has a federal election in 2019. What should the people of Canada be focusing on to ensure there's no election fraud?
Well, traditionally the Canadian federal elections are pretty doggone transparent, and transparency means secure. In other words, unless something has changed from the last time I checked, there are the scrutineers. Everything is conducted in public. It's done with paper, and you can really stand there and confirm that what you're told is the result is the result. The one thing about those kinds of elections, the one vulnerable area where we sometimes see tampering occur is when they combine all the results together at the end. So let's say they're going to pull in every little local polling place for the province of Ontario or for Toronto or whatever, next bigger subunit. And at the point they pull in all those results, they sometimes change them. And they actually had to run a new election in Kenya, in Africa, because that's what they did. They had all these polling places, and it was all very open, and they had international observers, and they counted them out. And then at the last minute, things changed when the final totals were announced. And one of the ways they diagnosed that is, when the final totals, when they added up every place, they refused to give out the individual totals for each place. Now picture this. Let's say you have 5 places, and they each submit their vote total, and they each have their little slip or whatever that says what their vote total was. And then you have the government say, well, here's the sum total of all the 5 places, but I'm not going to tell you how much each one had. And that would force you to then go to every single polling place and hope they kept their slip of paper and compare it and see if it all adds up. So that's, in the very transparent elections, that's kind of one of the remaining areas of vulnerability. So they really should publish, it's like show your math, show your work when you do an arithmetic problem. When you're going to announce a result, announce all the subparts at the same time.
Well, it seems to me, yes, they do report every little polling station. I mean, some places, especially in rural places in Canada, it's 5 or 6 people. So it's pretty easy to see if the number of votes cast matches up with the number of people who showed up.
As long as they report it, right. The areas where these things go wrong is when, yes, everybody can see it at that little place with 5 or 6 people. But then you have, let's say, the provincial government or whatever the reporting, there's one central place where they report it. And if they just give you a number and they don't give you all the individual precincts that make up that number, then you can never compare. I mean, how do you know what anybody, it's just something you could just pull out of a hat and say, well, here's the result. You have to be able to show the accounting, in other words. And the places where they do it properly, they do. It goes right up on the web, so you can see it. You can see it at the polling place, and you can also see it when they announce the sum total of all the results. They break it all down, and you can make sure it all adds up and that it matches. So Canada has pretty good, or at least has had, as I say, I don't keep track of these things every year, but they've had some pretty good stuff for their federal elections, but their municipal elections and their local have sometimes been very sketchy.
I was just about to ask how accurate the vote is in Canada. So, again, the big stuff, federal and provincial, well, they have Elections Canada, Elections BC, bureaucrats who look after it, who apparently are supposed to be neutral and don't care who wins or loses. But again, the smaller the election, then the more likely, or the most likely, that it could be rigged.
Well, and at the provincial level too, the idea that people are neutral and don't care is kind of, you can't really depend on that, because you have to literally look at it like votes are like money, okay? And you can't get inside someone's head to know whether they care or not, or whether they, had their arm twisted or they were coerced or whatever. What you have to have is make sure that the public can actually see the steps and that they can confirm it. So if they're announcing to you, trust us, this is the result, and if it's using computer counting, you ask to see have somebody, if you suspect that there's an issue, you just say, well, I'd like to look at the ballot images. And if they start squirming, then you know that you may have hit on something.
Well, because politicians are the ones who run things, who will investigate them for possible election fraud after they've won?
It has to be the public, because the politicians, the government will never, politicians will simply not do that. They've got, even if they suspect something's wrong, there's this political pressure on them to go along, to get along, and it'll be like, yes, your election really got messed up, but don't worry, next time around we'll support you some more, and just don't rock the boat. It really has to be a public function, public oversight. And that doesn't mean we have to look and audit every election and look at every ballot. It means that we need to be able to, if we want to.
President Trump
a big distinction there, because there's a lot of things that it's like, yeah, that it totally makes sense that guy won. He got 80% of the votes. But there may be something else where you go, that just doesn't look right, and I want to take a closer look.
President Trump has put the Department of Homeland Security in charge of the voter fraud investigation in the U.S. How have you heard how the investigation is going?
I haven't heard pretty much anything. Supposedly they have approached some of the election officials and given them some security measures. One of the areas, they really were never able to examine or document anything in terms of the count of the vote in 2016, because these election voting machines, they were destroying, as we previously discussed, they were destroying the evidence, and nobody could look at the programs and so forth. But there was an area that they know had hackers involved. Well, whether the hackers were Russian or something else isn't as clear as they'd like to say. But the voter lists themselves. And we also do voter check-in using electronic poll books sometimes. And there's some benefits to that. I'm going to be coming out with a report on that pretty soon. And there was hacking of the voter list as far as who could vote and where they could vote, and things were altered. And in fact, in some cases, the lists were so altered that it really created delays and slowdowns and questions on Election Day. So I suspect the Homeland Security is looking at ways to protect those voter lists, because those things were leaking out onto the web. There was like this tremendous mess with people getting their hands into them. Now, you should be able to look at them, but you shouldn't be able to go into the database and start changing things.
Is it true there are 3.5 million more people registered to vote in the U.S. than there are actual votable citizens in the U.S.?
Well, that's kind of a distraction. The problem with that is the voter lists are sort of unique to each location or jurisdiction. And people will move they don't necessarily notify the registrar of elections that they moved. And so their name is sitting there on a list that they don't even live there anymore. That doesn't, they don't run back there and vote. They just, think about it. Every single person who moves out of an apartment complex to go move someplace else, or even into another province, they just don't necessarily take that extra step to tell people they moved. So this debris accumulates, and people die and so forth. Those are supposed to be pulled off the list, but they aren't always. See, this voter debris accumulates, and they have rules as to how and when you can take it off. And if nobody has notified them that they no longer live there, and we don't have to vote, do we know if they don't live there, or do we know if they just decided not to vote for a few elections? And so they do these things like they wait 2 years and they send out a card, and if you respond, so there's a lot of those extra voters over and above the number of citizens is just debris. But, in other words, people who it's just a function of they don't purge the list very often, and they have clunky rules for doing it. But that's where we get into huge risks with vote by mail and absentee voting. Because if you have a lot of debris on the list, you've got, let's say, 100,000, I've seen locations that have, up to 100,000 people, on the list that are not really shouldn't really be on the list. They moved or whatever. If you have that many extra names, you can just go through and cast ballots in those names, and it'll never be caught. So they represent, when voter lists are not cleaned, they represent a slush fund that can be used to cast votes in those names using vote by mail and absentee voting.
It said some Democrats were encouraging illegal immigrants to vote in the presidential election. Was that legal or illegal to do?
Well, it'd be very illegal. I never saw that actually. There's always claims of things like that, and I didn't actually see it documented. There's such easier ways to steal an election than to run around trying to urge somebody who's not a citizen to vote. It's just a complicated and clunky way to do it. You always hear in the U.S., they were busloads of people being bussed in and they were casting ballots. And it's like with all the days of cell phones, nobody has ever captured that on a phone or on video. And it's like, you know what, unless you can show me somebody who actually got that on their phone, maybe we shouldn't be trying that old tired thing out. It's not, again, that would be the dumbest and the clunkiest and most difficult and expensive way to do it. There's so much easier ways to do it now. In terms of rigging elections.
Right. If you were in charge of the voting process in Canada and the U.S., what would you do to combat election fraud?
I would, as far as who can vote, I would really be diligent about making sure the lists are up to date and clean. And as far as who did vote, I would make sure that if it's allowed, it's not allowed here in the U.S., but that we have polling place voting, so a real person, a genuine human body has to come in there, not a bunch of phantoms that come in through the mail, and that they have good check-in procedures and accounting procedures for that. And in terms of the counting of the vote, either if it's a smaller location or it's a single race on the ballot, the public hand counting of the vote is still the gold standard. If it's complicated and there's a whole bunch of races on the ballot and it's a big, complicated jurisdiction, then, and you're going to use voting machines, then you use the ones that take a picture of every ballot. You make sure that there's a unique ID so that, the actual ballot can be matched up. And I would make sure that anybody can see the pictures immediately, and anybody who requests can come in and inspect any ballot they want or all of the ballots. And, the main thing you want is you want to make it dangerous for somebody to tamper with the election. You don't want these people to just have absolute ability to do it and know they'll never get caught. You want to make it so they don't know. That's what's so great to have public oversight. They don't know who's going to get a bee in their bonnet and decide to come look at everything, and that's why you want to make sure anybody can look at it.
Well, one of the close associates of former Prime Minister Stephen Harper was convicted of voter tampering by arranging robocalls to people who were suspected of wanting to vote for the opposition, and they were directed to non-existent polling stations. And he did end up serving hard jail time. So there are consequences. I think it was...
Oh, yes.
And that's the kind of thing that...
and the disinformation side of things is, through the robocalls. Yeah, I know that was a huge scandal in Canada. So, yes, there is, there's a lot of, one of the things I'm working on right now is a book on, how corruption works in the first world countries. We're not doing things where the cop on the corner threatens to, beat your head in if you don't pay him a bribe. But we have tremendous amount of corruption. And, part of that whole thing is I don't think people realize how many of these political officials actually are corrupt. I was very surprised when I started documenting it. A tremendous amount of election officials, have gone to jail because they rigged their election. There was a woman in Alabama. Their names are sometimes just almost hilarious, but her name was Mrs. Tinker, and she rigged the absentee vote. And then when she got caught, they put all the ballots in a vault, and she tried to break into the bank, and then they couldn't break in, and so they burned a hole in the people do things that you just don't believe. We just want to trust that everybody's a great, honest politician, and that's lovely, but we need to be able to exercise oversight if we so choose.
Well, I believe for municipal politicians especially, the biggest bribe isn't that they give them an envelope stuffed with cash, but developers and so on will contribute tremendous amounts of money to their election campaign. And that's the way they influence.
But they also launder the incentives a lot of different ways. And one of the things I think that will help, and I've got a section on this in the upcoming book I'm working on, but it'll be a while before it's out. I think if the public learns to understand how politicians launder their bribes. It often doesn't look like a bribe, and then when you look a little closer, in the U.S. we saw quite a few of them using a nonprofit charity to launder their bribes, and they would get their buddies to, give a donation that's tax deductible to a nonprofit charity, and then it would just go directly into their personal bank account. So the way that they do it, basically they run things through different conduits. And so it's not obvious, but a lot of them do it for, flat out money. And there's, as you mentioned, developers. Oh my goodness, the amount of money for development, construction, road building, insurance contracts, bond issuance, that kind of stuff is staggering. And it is, I was very, very surprised to see, just going off of indictments and convictions, the sheer number of politicians who succumb to the temptation and get caught.
Bev, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
How can people find out more about black box voting?
Well, we have a website, blackboxvoting.org, and I will be, I'm working on updating the Black Box Voting book. It's online for free at blackboxvoting.org. That's a 2004 edition. I'm working to update it with a lot of the new technology, because there's a lot of new wrinkles in what they're doing now. And then I'm also working on, as I mentioned, a book that sort of documents how corruption is done in modern-day society. It's much more subtle, but it exists, and by understanding how it works, then we can also prevent a lot of it. There's a lot of solutions, but you don't get to the solution if you don't know it exists.
Thanks again, Bev.
Thank you.
My guest has been Bev Harris, founder of Black Box Voting, online at blackboxvoting.org. She was speaking to us from Carlsbad, Washington. If you have any questions for Bev Harris or any of our other guests or the show, you can send your questions to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.